I love that. I love that. And, what is it, I guess, to connect it back? I think letting go, for example, of the myth of sameness or the myth of meritocracy or the myth of exceptionalism that we hold on so tightly to the United States, to this notion of what this country is about. It's like we can appear so fragile. The ego, the collective ego of this country can feel so fragile that anyone who questions the exceptional nature of the United States is somehow seen as not loving that which is good. And, that dialectical tension is certainly something I've seen for the entirety of my life. Somehow protesting the Vietnam War, for example, was seen as anti-American. And yet, nothing more loving to stand up fiercely for the right to question the decisions of those in power.
This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. That's Jerry Colonna, the coach, facilitator, and author. Jerry helps people lead mindfully and with humility, clarity, grace, humanity, and equanimity in his work as the co-founder of the company Reboot, a coaching company where he's created a suite of services focused on helping all sorts of leaders and companies, from young venture-backed entrepreneurs to people in the C-suite of Fortune 100 companies. The underlying principle behind Reboot is their belief that better leaders lead to better humans and companies. The underlying principle underneath that is better organizations can make a better world. All of this work contributes to the idea that work is not just a thing that has to destroy us, but it presents an opportunity to create a space that promotes systemic belonging for all people, regardless of their gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, background, or life experiences. Jerry and I have known each other for almost 30 years when I was still a reporter at the New York Times, and he was a venture capitalist in New York at Flatiron Partners, Silicon Alley's most dynamic venture capital firm during the dot-com era. Jerry was a 2023 guest on the podcast where we explored his life experiences growing up as a reporter and as a venture capitalist. In that episode, we discussed the concepts of radical self-inquiry and the importance of systemic belonging, and touched upon a book he had been working on related to that topic. The book, Reunion, Leadership, and the Longing to Belong, was recently published by HarperCollins. Building on the ideas of his first book, which was named Reboot, in Reunion, Jerry encourages leaders to consider the ways that they have perpetuated and benefited from the conditions in the world that they say they would like to change. In painting a roadmap for leaders to help change the world, Jerry hones in on the concept of belonging. Jerry points out the important role that managers and leaders play in creating welcoming environments, but poignantly notes that many people fall into traps of toxic leadership that he believes they can overcome. A key element, he writes, is that leaders must first face their own need for belonging and how it's thwarted. And he says that through this form of self-inquiry, we can create a safe home for ourselves and for others. Jerry uses a unique blend of narrative quotes, poetry, stories from the lives of his clients and his own to make those points in Reunion. These are points that I believe are not so much applicable just to leaders in a corporate environment or even in the workplace, but at home, in the community groups that we're a part of, and any other place where someone has power over others. In a day and age where discussions about self-awareness can be found on every corner of the office, the internet, or at home, we're going to discuss what radical self-inquiry is, what its fruits truly are, and what it truly means to belong and how to build a sense of belonging for others. Hey, Jerry, so I wanted to thank you for joining. This is the second time you're on the podcast. I think, you were on one of like 3 or 4 episodes that we launched on our first day. And over the course of the last year, I've told people many times that my episode with you forever changed the focus of the podcast, because I realized in that, I had initially thought, based on my work, that I would focus on psychology in the workplace. And what I realized was that what I was really focusing on was how we can learn and grow from our experiences and our and adversity that we face, how we can really have conversations that inspire people and make people feel whole, right? Not terminally unique, and find good paths. So I just wanted to thank you for that, because, we did a listeners episode at the end of the year, and, a number of the people talk about that episode, and a number of the people talk about what grace they've gotten from the podcast. And I definitely credit you for some of that. So I appreciate that.
Well, God bless you for saying so. I'm not sure what to say, other than I'm actually deeply touched. And I feel what you're doing is exceedingly important. And I think that what you're doing is really about making it safe for human beings to show up, sure, in the workplace, but really in their lives.
Yeah.
And I can't think of a better term for that than grace.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that I will steal your phrase, terminally unique. Because that is a winner.
Which, by the way, I stole from my first therapist in rehab, who said, Jason, you are not terminally unique. And, it was my resistance to do group therapy, and it was very fascinating. And, I, like many people who go through addiction, think that my experience and my suffering was so unique that I wasn't fixable, right? That I was
Right.
broken. And she encouraged me to go into a group, and it was right around 9/11, and it was a group of it was a gay men's group, even though I'm not gay, because she was like, they're intellectual and you like those people. And what I realized was I wasn't alone, and that was a gift she gave me.
Yeah, well, let's carry that through to what you're doing with this podcast. You're sending out a message filled with grace, which is that none of us ultimately are alone. We're all connected by what we perceive to be our brokenness. And as a result, we all have the opportunity to redeem what was broken and to live into a greater sense of what is possible. So bless you for doing the work you do. Because what I see you doing, sir, is being brave, and trigger warning, I'm about to curse, brave as fuck, with telling your own truth, which conversely, or maybe unexpectedly, makes it safe for those of us who don't have a microphone.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think I view it as sort of like I don't want to say obligation. It's both an obligation and a gift.
Yep.
But and not only rewarding, but there's a sense of purpose that's found in, and I've talked about this before, I think with you, that I didn't have a choice for my suffering to be public, but one of the good things that comes out of it created an avenue for me to talk to other people about my suffering, which allowed or even my poor choices, right? That allowed them to then talk about theirs that are often in the shadows or they feel like they have to hide. And when someone comes to me and they say that they feel more comfortable being able to talk about their suffering or their mistakes,
Mm.
Stephen Colbert said this like perfectly. And I really do believe it. He said that what punishments of God are not gifts. And his point, which I thought was so powerful, is that suffering is unavoidable as a human, but going through suffering allows you to better relate to people and to love them more deeply. And I think there's real truth to that.
Amen. You know, we were joking before we hit record. I was telling you that I just turned 60. And what you just said is one of the pearls that took me a long, long time to have learned. And now that I'm 60, it feels embedded in my eldering body that to just carry that forward.
Yeah. Well, I think about like when we were 30 years ago or 25
As I
years ago.
pointed out to you.
Right? Yes, as you're the one who pointed out. But if you think back to that time,
Mm,
both of us, by the
yeah.
time we were in our 20s, had experienced, um, you know, a lot of suffering. And there were the seeds to building something better. And maybe at that time I didn't know what I was doing. I think about like with you and your venture capital work, I don't know
Mm,
whether it was intentional on your part to find companies that would do good in the world.
mm.
But I think you're probably already on the journey of taking your pain and turning it into something good. And it's been really neat to watch it evolve over
Oh,
time.
well, thank you for that. I think, to just comment on what you said. I don't know that I set out intentionally to focus on companies that were intending to make the world a little bit better. But what I was always drawn to, and this includes my previous career as a reporter, I was always drawn to stories, and I was always drawn to the human behind the story. And I think that has been a hallmark of literally every iteration of every career I've ever had. From the beginning as a young pup reporter to being an investor to becoming a coach to building a company and now being a published author. I've always been drawn to stories because I think that that's how we come to know that we're not alone.
Right. Because it's the way I think, and, my path similar, but it's
Mm,
the way that we understand the world and understand our connections
mm,
between us and other people. And I think, it's important to take care in telling those stories and take care in helping people find their
mhm.
stories, and when that's done, I think it can be so impactful and so powerful for people. And it goes back to your new book Reunion, which that idea for me of, and it seems so interesting. Like we talk about things like teamwork and we talk about things like family and we think of loved ones, and most people will say that some form of that is important, but that word that you use, belonging,
Mhm.
finding a sense of belonging, and then also I don't know that it's purely an opposite, that opposite of othering that
Mhm.
exists
Mhm.
is a conversation that we don't really have. Like we talk around it for some reason.
Right. Well, yeah, I think first of all, I agree with you that they're not balanced opposites. This notion of systemic othering, which to give credit where credit is due, I first heard the term from John A. Powell at the Othering and Belonging Institute out of Berkeley. And but I think that they are cousins, if you will. They're related. And as you know from my first book, I think that human beings are organized around the pursuit of love, safety, and belonging. And, in a sense, belonging becomes inclusive of all. If I know that where I belong, then I can feel safe. And if I'm not safe, I can't belong.
It's interesting that you say that so recently. As you can imagine, 20 plus years later, I still get attacked by people for what happened at the New York Times. And I understand it. Like I have a lot of compassion for people and their perspectives. But there was one recent attack from like inside my circle, right? Like inside my circle that was very public. And one of my close friends in that circle asked me, why is this one as opposed to the other ones affecting you? And I said that the first untethering of my sense of belonging in life was my break with the church. And I lost all that I knew. And then my second one, major one, was my break with the Times and journalism.
Right.
And that there is something about that circle that, of loving relationships where we trust each other. And I should caveat this by saying I have a lot of grace for this person. They have some of their own things going on in their life that have made it very difficult for them. So I'm certainly understanding and have that same compassion that I hope people will have for me, for them. But what I realized was my fear, what made this uncomfortable as opposed to the thousands of other ones I've seen, was that I was afraid again of losing my sense of belonging within that group.
Can I just say, my first impulse was to be angry because I have watched you from afar and I have seen you do your work. And I have never witnessed you disavow responsibility for, as you put it, choices that you made, even though there is a cloud of what you were experiencing personally, internally, biologically. And I think that that a foundational component of creating belonging in our community is a notion of redemption.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, what is the purpose of religion if not to create opportunities of redemption?
Yeah. That concept of second. And one of my friends who was a part of that conversation back and forth with this person, you know, said the other person who was making the attack said something along the lines of, "Are you going to give him 67 chances?" And my friend responded, "I give people as many chances as they need." And yeah, that was unbelievably powerful for me. But I would also say, without my poor choices and without the suffering that occurred for them, I don't even think I could have given this person the grace that I'm able to give them. So I do believe that thing that Colbert said, like, this punishment has been a gift.
And I wonder then, therefore, if it's in fact even punishment.
That is true. I agree. And I feel I lost my mom earlier in October, and I feel the very same way about that. Like, I walked out of both her funeral and at her deathbed. I was sitting right beside her. I was blessed enough to like be holding her during her last breath, or sitting beside her during her last breath. And my thoughts, I thought, would turn to sadness, but they turned toward gratitude, and they turned toward the parts of my mom that I realized were in me and the parts of my other ancestors that I realized that were in me that I know I want to carry on, that I want to bring more of in the world. And I'm not sure those things are actually punishments.
Yeah. Well, I just want to pause and honor your mother. What was her first name?
Fran.
May her soul rest in peace. Fran, Jason is a good person, and he's doing well in the world.
You know, someone asked me what are you grateful for this year? And I said that I'm grateful for the fact that my mother died,
Mm.
being proud of me and knowing that I would be okay.
Yeah.
I
May
guess
her
that's
soul rest in peace, right?
right. Right. And it's that, I mean, in that, I think of my relationship with her and that sense of belonging that came from that. And I'm just glad that I've had the other experiences that have allowed me to start to build that in other places, and even frankly to facilitate or be a part of helping other people find that.
Mm-hmm.
Because, to your point about her soul resting in peace, what I find is that when people find a sense of belonging in life, their soul gets peace early.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you.
Yeah. And so why did you decide to focus on this, the othering and belonging? And what I would say the key ingredient, I think, is that idea of radical self-inquiry, that to build belonging in other people, for other people as a leader. And I don't think it's just leaders at work, leaders at home, leaders in communities, anyone who has power over someone else, that you have to build that belonging for yourself, it seems.
Well, I think you just nailed it. I mean, you know, in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of, a kind of radical re-examination of how we are with one another, manifested in everything like protests in the streets to really calling into question power structures. One of the things that happened for me was that I was really called, and I tell this story, by my daughter to go further than I had gone, if you will, in my first book, Reboot. In Reboot, I talked about this process. I called it Leadership in the Art of Growing Up. And I talked about the process of using leadership, and by your extension, I think it's a great extension, using the experience of being in a power position to complete the work of being the best human we can be, of being an adult, to use that language.
Right.
And then I began to look at the question of, well, being a better human, because I use the phrase often, better humans make better leaders. Being a better human doesn't end at my own body, right? Being a better human means, what am I doing to create the possibility for love, safety, and belonging for other people?
And I imagine also a part of that must be, what am I doing, whether intentional or not,
Exactly.
to
Yes.
undermine that?
That's right. That's right. Both intentional or not. Just like in my first book, the core organizing question was, how have I been complicit in creating the conditions in my life that I say I don't want? We are oftentimes complicit in and benefiting from the conditions in the world that we shake our head at. We say, for example, we don't want to live in a world or in a country that is obsessed with guns. But what does that really mean?
Mm.
And we don't want to live in a world where leaders are chastised because they diversify those who represent their brand in an ad, right? Something as silly as
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And yet, what do we do about it? And what is our responsibility, moral and otherwise, to challenge those things?
You're reminding me of something sort of like
Mm,
post-journalism
mm,
career for me, which was very much about helping people and bringing better things into the world. And I remember this one moment being at a march and protesting and listening to the people who were talking and realizing for myself, I'm just out here protesting. But like, what am I really doing in my day to day in my life to empower women? And
mm,
that just happened to
mm.
be the topic. And
Right.
then I realized I'm out here protesting, but that's about it.
Mhm.
And that was it was an interesting journey for me. That, in the interesting part of it, of course, Jerry, it created a lot of cognitive dissonance because there was a little voice in my head saying, no, you're fine, no, you're not doing enough, and another part of me was saying, actually, you're doing harm. And so it
Mm,
very much, I think, helped me become more aware
mm,
and conscious
mm.
and proactive, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. I mean, yet again, my friend, we find our journeys being so similar. I mean, that was so much of the profound journey that I went through in writing this book was having moments, continuous moments of, wait, what have I been doing? I talk about being committed to compassion and empathy. Well, what does that really look like? And how am I using what power I have to not only do some positive good, but to not do harm, which is very complicated. It's very, very tough. And I applaud you for asking yourself that question. But honestly, it doesn't surprise me because I would argue you've been on a journey of radical self inquiry for decades.
It's interesting. Yeah, because a lot of my earlier experiences in life made me question everything about myself, and not just in a negative way, but like the gap between the way I perceive myself and reality. And taking a simple example, just having a mental illness, being diagnosed with bipolar, and what does that mean to who I am versus who I perceive myself to be, or choosing to fabricate or plagiarize stories? Who am I compared to who I want to be? And it's not really binary because I'm both. I think
Mhm.
there's that point in your book where you discuss being in high school,
Yeah.
and you were at Murrow High School, right?
I
And
was in
yeah,
Brooklyn.
yeah,
Hmm.
in Brooklyn. And you talk about that group that existed to sort of like look at and explore sort of racial challenges
Right.
within Murrow, and that there was that facilitator, a black man, who made that comment. You had made a comment that, we're all the same under our skin, which is
Right.
what we're taught, right? Like that
Right.
is the message that is sent to us. And the facilitator told you, hey man, that's a myth.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll give credit where credit is due again. So the group was, I believe, part of something called the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And it was originally formed to combat anti Semitism. And by the time I was in high school, the facilitators would go from high school to high school, really linking that early work with combating anti Black racism and other forms. We didn't use the term othering, but clearly other forms of making the other. And I was invited to participate, and there were a group of us, and it was a really instructive moment because it was a moment that stuck with me even now. I mean, it's 45 years later, and I can still see the look on his face, and I felt a bit of shame at the moment. Later, I was reading Bell Hooks' book on killing rage, on ending racism. And it was there, I think, that she talked about beloved difference, which is such a beautiful phrase. Um, and to that we don't have to mask difference in order to unite ourselves. We don't have to mask what is what makes us unique in order to come together.
So in that moment, you said you felt a matter of shame, and
Yeah,
it's a very interesting word, because I think when I was younger and I missed something like that, I
right.
did feel shame, and over time, I realized that shame isn't always productive. But it sounds like you turned that insight into something productive.
Well, I guess, call me fortunate, call me well trained, but even in that moment, and call the facilitator skillful, because what he did not do was chastise me, right? And
Right.
so he lifted up a lesson, and the lesson was, well, hold on. What are you actually saying about that? And because of that moment, I began to explore what I in the book I call it the myth of sameness, which I think is a parallel to the myth of exceptionalism, right? And what if you look at those two myths that so mark the American experiment, it's it fails not only it causes us to fail to not only see difference, but it also it causes us to overlook when we fail to live up to the aspirational goals. And so coming all the way back to that moment, and I love that you picked out that moment. What happened for me was I went from being shamed, feeling shamed, and therefore shutting down, to being curious and really
Mm,
saying, what did this man really mean?
yeah.
Because it went against everything, as you point out, everything that we were taught in those turbulent times, the post 1960s. We're talking 1977 when this happened for me. And to think about, it's like, well, what does it actually mean to be in community? Do I have to make you fit a normative structure that falls under this notion of sameness for us to be in community?
It's so interesting because it is, to your point, very much in the American experience, there is a need or drive to feel like we that the accepted people, or that we are so similar. And I actually think it minimizes one of the beauties of America. It's that our differences can coexist, and in our
Right.
best moments swim in beautiful directions.
I think you're saying it better than I did. I mean, I think that you know this scene that happened to me, um, or this experience that happened to me, which I don't mean to overplay it, but it was seminal in the sense that it was like in Buddhism we would call it a pointing out instruction, where someone wiser, an elder, looks at us and says, not quite, not so fast there, buddy boy. Think of it this way. And, I had the same experience. Quite frankly, I was reading a brilliant essay by James Baldwin called The Price of the Ticket. And he talks
Hmm.
about, and he's referring to the ticket of whiteness and the movement of people, especially those of us of European descent, into a dominant culture. And he talks about, the Anglicization of names, and he talks about sort of disconnecting from our past as a means to moving towards the safety of dominance.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Jerry, because do you think that part of the reason why we need to have this sense of sameness is rooted in some of our guilt about our past? I take an example of I was in a group of friends, and someone had brought up Bigfoot. And they had made some casual comment about that. And no one else in the group, other than one woman who is Native American in the group, realized, she said it drives her a little mad when people make those kinds of comments about Bigfoot or make jokes about it. Because in her culture, and she was Ojibwe, the Bigfoot, Sasquatch, is actually a sacred being that sort of brought them and created their world. And in that moment, for me, I thought that there's so many things that where I need us to feel similar that I end up dishonoring the beauties of our differences. And I wonder whether some element of that for me is I need to feel, or I have some need or some drive to feel that we're all the same, so I can erase in my head the horrible things that I am partially, right? Because I'm not all black, that I'm partially, or my ancestors are partially responsible for.
I think you're hitting upon it. It's hard for me to describe what it is for you, but I think that looking at it purely from the lens of my own experience as a white identifying cisgender male, straight male, I think that guilt may be one of the words. Fear definitely seems to be embedded in that. Fear of the loss of status, fear of the loss of that which my ancestors fought to gain. Think about, for example, the number of people who both disown the parts of their family tree that do not fit a shining example of aspirational values, coupled with the movement that many ancestors who emigrated to the United States, many, not all, movement away from, say, speaking the language of their birth or discouraging their children from speaking the language of their birth, to not staying open to it. And so I think part of it is shame. Part of it is guilt. Part of it is, I don't know what to make of this. All right. So how did you and your friends react when your friend pointed out about the stories and the importance of Sasquatch?
We told her, and I think there was unanimity in this, that it was a blessing because it was a gift to us, because she was able to articulate her point in a way that didn't leave anyone feeling defensive, allowed others to learn and explore and come to a better understanding. And I felt not only would it, for me, help in other interactions I had, it would help me even more in just being mindful, not just for Native Americans, of anyone's differences for me. And for me, hearing the story ended up not in that way, but being a blessing, because I learned more about a culture that's contributed to who I am that I didn't even realize. So that's where we landed.
Well, I love the fact that in the end, she was received with curiosity. And I want to honor her skill at being able to do that and recognize that in that moment, she had every right to be angry.
Absolutely.
And I can only imagine, empathetically imagine, how often she was not received in the way that you all received her.
Or
And
didn't even feel safe enough.
to safe enough to say anything. That's
Yep.
right. That's right. That's right. And you know, I think what I admire about that story is multiple levels. I admire her strength. I admire her precision, her clarity, her fierceness. I am saddened that she needed that. And I admire the way you all received it without defensiveness, but curiosity. Because, if you will, that's the whole point of the book that I wrote. That's what I'm trying to engender is empathy. You know,
At its
going
core.
past, going past like false equivalencies. You know, when I explore in depth the experience of my ancestors, it is not to offer them as an equivalent to, say, your ancestors, but by connecting with their experience, I hope to create more receptivity to hearing your story.
You know, a great example for me of that same thing was a book that, and this was right after the Times. One of the things that happened after the Times, I had a lot of time on my hands and a lot of time to think. So
Right.
I would go to the Barnes and Noble in Union Square with a bag and just buy books. And one of the books I bought was The Diary of an Irish Slave Girl. And it was an Irish girl, I think from, I may get it wrong, but it was somewhere in Southern Ireland. And it may have been Galway, and her family had gotten into some kind of debt. And a part of that, she was indentured and then taken to the Caribbean. And just being able to learn that experience and honor that experience opened me up. So, you know, over time, many, you know, friends who are Irish, right, from the island or Irish American would talk to me about my pain and suffering and the pain and suffering of my ancestors. And I was able to turn to them and say, don't diminish your own.
Yeah.
Because they suffered in deep ways that while you're sitting here with your guilt, right? We share way more in common, even though we're very different. We share way more in common than I think we realize. And that's that part of empathy that I think comes from learning and going beyond the surface of what we're taught or what's put in our face and trying to really. And, you know, you can do it very intentionally where you say, I want to learn about a certain culture or thing. But I think if you're just curious, it can help so much.
I think you just said it intensely. And we need to be very, very careful. The experience of, say, the Irish being transported to Australia or being sent as indentured servants around the world has elements that can create an empathetic bridge to those who have had enforced diaspora, enforced enslavement. But there is a difference. Yes. And that difference needs to be acknowledged and honored. And, you know, I, you know, maybe I'm profoundly optimistic about human beings, but I think that we can hold the polarity of both similarity and difference simultaneously. And I think when I think about policy decisions, or when I think about governance, or I think about their use of power, whether it's in business or community or political states. And I see a lack of acknowledgement about both similarity and difference. I think that's the result is policies that actually do more harm than good.
Yeah. And even taking that example that you said of I think it was like, I don't know, it was hundreds of thousands of people who were forced to Australia, and many of them were Irish. There also needs to be a recognition that while our experiences are similar, that there were inflection points in history where they became very different. And
That's
that
right.
while we may be able to connect on that, we also have to, I guess, coming back to your original point, to truly understand the world around us and be empathetic, we have to understand those differences. Because there
Yeah.
may be a moment where those Irish in Australia were very much like the indigenous people, but
Mm-hmm.
that branched and that changed. And understanding that not only does it allow you to get the value of diversity, it helps build that empathy for people. I think.
And I would say I'm with you in the I think that that's correct. I certainly know that in my experience of being educated, there are whole parts of this experience. It's called the movement towards whiteness that were lost, that were just not shared. It was a kind of presumption that you know things were always this way. And even though I'd read plenty of books talking about race as a construct, as a social construct, to really experience, well, what does that mean? And more importantly, what did it mean to those to whom I see myself as belonging? How
Mm.
did they respond? And what is my responsibility to the world and to my descendants?
Yeah. One of the key fundamental ingredients that you talk about in the book is, and I know in my work, I often talk about self awareness and how
Mm.
I often say self awareness is not particularly helpful unless it's actionable, right?
Ah,
Unless you
right.
know the impact on other people. It's good to know how I perceive myself, but it's really
Right.
helpful to know the way. But that idea of radical self inquiry being a foundation of this, what is that? What does that look like? And what do you view as the importance of it to getting to this empathetic place where you can help people build a sense of belonging and you can also belong? Because I think there are some of us who work against our own belonging very
Yes.
intentionally out of fear.
Yeah. So we're choosing safety in that regard.
Right.
I think that it's important to start with the definition of radical self inquiry, which is something I coined, I don't know, 15, 16 years ago. And it's this notion um, that the masks that we wear to protect ourselves are slowly and compassionately brought down, stripped away, so that there's no place left to hide from ourselves.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that pausing and realizing that, oh, this is an important process in the art of growing up. This is an important process in taking full accountability and responsibility. We talked about the word redemption before, of moving towards a redeemed state, if you will. And to then overlay that and apply that in this larger circle, which is, okay, so I thrust my fist in the air to shout about some injustice. Let me be clear about my own experience of that, not to invoke guilt, which shuts us down from action, but to actually ground our actions in empathy and compassion so that our actions are not performative.
Mm. What do you think from your perspective? Like, I know some people are going to take this book as a leadership book
Mm,
for workplace, right? But I
right.
think it's bigger than that because you talk about the idea of like anyone who has power really considering what they've, you know,
Mm,
doing that hard work of considering the role we play in creating empathy, creating compassion, and then
mm,
also taking it away or harming it. And then thinking about leaders more broadly, whether it's me leading my family or
mm,
my company or being a leader in my group of friends, or even in a social dynamic with someone, we both host podcasts, which creates
mm,
parasocial relationships where people are giving a lot to us and we're not able to give back the same to them, but we have a platform. Like, what is that for you? The importance of people leading in all those realms of radically exploring themselves, because those people do have power over us. We do have power over people. So I'm
right.
curious what your thought on that is.
Well, I first of all, I agree with you that I think many of the things that I wrote about and explored in Reunion are applicable beyond the realms of corporations. I wrote with that particular angle because it's an endemic milieu in which I operate, and I feel a responsibility to use whatever resources and power I have to influence the realms and domains that I have the most influence in. And so that's why I sort of framed it in that way. I think this is incredibly important, however, and I keep thinking of this image of us trying to build, let's call it a house of belonging. And to quote a poem by David White, trying to build a house of belonging. And this is, in fact, the foundational work. And as any home builder knows, if you build a house without a good foundation, it will blow over in the first storm. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, quite frankly, is a lot of houses were built on poor foundations and they're blowing over in the storms.
The title,
Mm,
Reunion, I keep thinking to myself as I went through the book, we're sort of reuniting with ourselves. We're coming home. We're
mm.
reuniting for others. Is what how do you look at that title, that idea of reunion?
Well, I think you nailed it. You know, I like the notion of reunion because for me, it's ultimately hopeful. It talks, implicit in that word is a goal state where acknowledging difference, but being back in a union that may or may not have existed in the past feels quite hopeful. And you're right.
Mm.
I do see it as a reunion with our ancestors, a reunion with the parts of ourselves that we'd really rather not look at, and a reunion, if you will, with others. Three great reunions, and I'll tell you that towards the end of writing the manuscript, I think it was in maybe the second year, the poet Bell Hooks passed away. And she was very, very good friends with my teacher, Sharon Salzberg. And I, like a lot of folks, just picked up copies of her poetry to reread. And I came across this beautiful collection of poems called When Angels Speak of Love. And in it, she writes, the first lines of that are something like, when angels speak of love, they tell us all things are union and reunion.
Mm.
And I was blown away by those few words. When angels speak of love, they tell us all things are union and reunion. And for me, it just summarized this notion of what I was trying to get to, which was that when we reconnect with the angels, and to me, angels are our ancestors, when we hear them speak of love, then it's possible to move towards union and reunion.
That made me think of something that you talk about in the book that's a part of the process. You know, you wrote about two things that I think, or maybe it's one thing that I think just like self-inquiry may be uncomfortable with. And you ask the question, that we need to ask ourselves, what do we have to give up that we love and value, including those perceptions of ourselves, which really ties back to the reuniting with ourselves, and we need to do that to create those systems of belonging. And there's this author I love, Judith Vorst, and she wrote this book called Necessary Losses. And
Right.
she writes about leaving and letting go. And she has this quote where she says, the path to human development is paved with renunciation,
Oh,
right? That by leaving and letting go is how we grow. And that's what makes those losses necessary.
oh, I love that. I love that. And, what is it, I guess, to connect it back? I think letting go, for example, of the myth of sameness or the myth of meritocracy or the myth of exceptionalism that we hold on so tightly to the United States, to this notion of what this country is about. It's like we can appear so fragile. The ego, the collective ego of this country can feel so fragile that anyone who questions the exceptional nature of the United States is somehow seen as not loving that which is good. And, that dialectical tension is certainly something I've seen for the entirety of my life. Somehow protesting the Vietnam War, for example, was seen as anti-American. And yet,
It made it more
nothing
loving to America.
more loving to stand up fiercely for the right to question the decisions of those in power.
Right, right. Both ourselves and others. I wanted to go ahead and give you a chance to, I so appreciate having you on again, but to just sort of close out with any closing thoughts. And I before I do that, I just want to say, Jerry, we didn't talk about it this time, but you did not grow up in the easiest home or the easiest childhood. And so often we're used to reading stories about people who go through those experiences and then go through bad things or do bad things. So I just want to honor the fact that through your adversity and suffering, you found the seeds in the soil to grow some beautiful things in the world. So,
Well, don't make me cry. Dude, I can't tell you how meaningful it is to me in this moment in my life to hear you say that. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. And I cannot take credit for that. I had a mother and a father who both struggled with their own mental illness challenges. As you know, I struggled with significant bouts of depression, including suicide attempts. And I was also incredibly fortunate to have stumbled upon a group of elders who raised me into second adulthood, including my first psychoanalyst, Dr. Sayers, whom I write about extensively in Reboot. And so whatever good I do in the world today stems from the elders who took a kind of ill-formed lump of clay, if you will, and made something of it. And so the fact that you're appreciating that, the fact that I might be doing a little bit of good, is just me paying them back.
Amen to that, my friend. Amen.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jerry. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the work that you do. And thank you. I'll say one more thing. Your close reading of Reunion moves me. It's not an easy book. It would have been easier for me to write Reboot 2, the rest of the story, if you will. But I wanted a book that would challenge both myself and those who consider themselves fans of my work.
Yeah.
And this is a challenging book. But hopefully it's a hopeful book. And that's what I would say is we feel the darkness of division right now. And I hope that this is a little bit of light in that darkness right now.
That's powerful. I once worked with a wonderful woman who became Filipino woman who became the first Navy, I think, woman surgeon. And she used to have coasters, like coffee coasters that she would put on her conference table. And they said, "Uncomfortable yet?" ? And I will tell you that your book is not for those who need to be comfortable.
Yes.
But I would encourage all of them who fear being uncomfortable to not run away from it, because there is such joy at the end of being uncomfortable.
Yeah. Amen, brother.
If you'd like to join us for more discussions with us and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us at our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. This is Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.